the fabric that will take us into the clouds fits in a canvas container that I think must be too small, much too small. And yet 5 people gather around it and they start yanking and pulling vigorously at winding them as they do this. And then they are pulling out this fabric, and it almost reminds me of a stage magician pulling a kerchief from their pocket where more and more fabric emerges from a place that you think there just can't possibly be any more room for all of that fabric. And it also reminds me of a magician's kerchief in that it is a riot of colors. Bright rainbow primary colors are spread out onto this plot of land, this plot of dusty earth in Santa Fe, into this enormous cloth rainbow. It's big enough to fit the foundation of an entire house upon. And then into a circle at the base of that fabric, a blowtorch starts up, a torch that is the size of a person. And slowly it starts to inflate a lung that is slowly lifting its way off the ground, becoming fuller and fuller. And then the basket that is dangling underneath it is just barely kissing the earth. And that's when the passengers are invited to board, and me with my trepidation, I step on, and I'm so worried about what will happen when that basket finally lifts off. I think that my departure from Earth must be something more momentous, more violent even than a simple drift. And yet I don't even notice when the lift occurs. Suddenly we are airborne, and we're rising higher and higher into the skies. And that is when the pilot of this hot air balloon in Santa Fe, this trip that I took back in February and this adventure that I had, that's when the pilot of this hot air balloon informs us there is no way to steer a hot air balloon. You must simply float, and wherever it puts you down, that's where it puts you down. Presumably, he would not put us down into a dangerous place. We would keep going until we found a safe place. Nonetheless, there is no steering the balloon. We are adrift in the wind. This last week, I read a book that one of our very own members recommended to me recently. Sally recommended this book to me. It's Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. Fabulous novel. This novel organizes itself around a fictional Greek play, and by fictional I mean, of course, like the Greek play is fiction, but it's also not a real Greek play. It's one that the author made up for the intention of this book. But it's a wonderful comedy, a whimsical comedy that was supposedly written by the Greeks. That's what the novel is saying. And in this comedy, you have this man who goes on this adventure, this utterly whimsical journey that is just full of contingency and accident. He wants to fly. He wants to be a bird. And he has this goal that he'll reach this utopia in the sky where all of the birds live that is called Cloud Cuckoo Land. And on his way to doing that, he eats some magical things, and one of those magical things turns him into a donkey. As apparently happens when you eat magical things, you don't always know what you're gonna be turned into, right? And so then he is driven cruelly by these people who mistake him for a donkey, who think he's a donkey. And at some point, though, he finds some magical roses and he eats those. And he turns into a fish and slips into the water, at which point he's eaten by a whale. And inside the whale is a wizard that the whale had eaten at one point, who then turns him into a bird. And then the whale regurgitates him. And he's like, I'm free, I'm a bird, I can finally go to Cloud Cuckoo Land, at which point he's promptly picked up by a cyclone, right? As it happens, right? When you're turned into a bird, this is the kind of thing that happens. And then he's tossed into space. He's tossed beyond the world. And eventually, by sheer accident at this point, he winds up in Cloud Cuckoo Land. And then the novel doesn't only have this play in it. The novel then takes the ancient comedy that is fictional and then turns it into something of a main character in this novel. And then the novel follows people who come across this ancient play and rescue it from burning Constantinople in the 1400s, and then ferret it away inside the Vatican, and then translate it in the Midwest. And then at one point, it culminates in rediscovering this ancient Greek comedy on a spaceship that is flying people away from Earth. It is pure accident, pure whimsy, and I couldn't get enough of it. It is, I was telling Sally, it's a bedtime story for adults. And you just want to know, like, what's going to be the next adventure, the next incident. And I think that there's something so real and so right about that in terms of what it tells us about the human imagination. There's something about the human imagination when it's done well, we're just captivated by it, and we just want to follow that author to the ends of the earth. At one point in the novel, it's reflecting on how the ancient Greeks came up with their comedies and their odysseys. And one of the characters speculates that it may have been as simple as the bard who was singing the story for the first time wanted another glass of wine. And so he or she or they thought, I'll just add in another segment here, another adventure. Okay, he's going to be swallowed by a whale now, right? In order to keep it going so that I can get that glass of wine. But there is a wonderful drift in this drift without direction, where we don't know where it's going to land, and yet we are happy to just go with the flow and see where it'll lead us. Now, both in terms of self-help advice and also in terms of theology, that's not a perspective that we often get. And I'm thinking about a book that had its moment a little while ago now, but it's one that kind of came to mind as I was thinking about this, because it kind of tells us that what we need to do with our lives is not sort of follow that sort of drift that leads us into new, interesting, exciting places, that allows us to imagine and that allows us to just sort of find the freedom of our lives and our moments. But rather, it tells us that we have to have a goal, that our life has to have a purpose, and we have to discover that purpose, and then we have to relentlessly pursue that purpose. In this book that had its moment a little while ago, the one that I'm thinking of is Rick Warren's A Purpose-Driven Life. And he says there that each person has their purpose that was given to them by God, and God, of course, knows us from origin to destiny, knows exactly where we're going to wind up, and has a purpose, has an intention for each of us. And our job is to follow that kind of intention rigorously, rigidly. Pursue your goal. That's what you need to do. I think it's a good thing that not all religious traditions, not all religious wisdom tells us that that's what we must do with our lives. And I'm thinking today specifically of a concept that comes from Taoism. It's the concept of Wu Wei. Some of you may be familiar with Wu Wei. It's translated variously, but one translation is inexertion, not exerting yourself, not pursuing a goal. It is allowing yourself to act by not acting. Wu Wei is very much the concept of going with the flow, of allowing yourself to simply be caught by the stream and pulled along by it. And then there's another tradition that I'm thinking of. And perhaps this is also an Eastern tradition. And so perhaps there's something about some of the Eastern traditions that has a bit more of a perspective on this than maybe our sort of late capitalist Protestant inherited culture has on it. But I think there's some real wisdom here. And this other tradition I'm thinking of, it's a story about the Buddha's life. And this particular story, I have tried to track down the origin of where I heard this for a couple of years now, and I have not been able to find it, but I remember distinctly hearing it when I was in divinity school, but the origin of the story has drifted away from me. Nonetheless, I remember the substance of it. Maybe one of you will be able to tell me where this is located. But it's a story about the Buddha, and at this point in the Buddha's life, he is about to leave a community. And as he's leaving, someone says to him, "Will you not be sad that you are leaving this community?" And his response is, "Clouds drift together, and then they drift apart. Such is the nature of life." Clouds drift together and then they drift apart. Such is the nature of life. And there is something somewhat tender, I think is the right word, about that impermanence, about the fact that our lives have that impermanence built into them, that our relationships are not permanent, that at one point in our lives we will meet and we drift together, and then at another point in our lives we drift apart. There is a bit of sadness in that. And at the same time, what that perspective encourages me to do is appreciate the poignancy, appreciate the beauty, appreciate the exquisite wonderment that is in the moments that we do come together and that we do have with each other. I think today of water communion. No water communion has ever been exactly like this one. And that's not only because of some of the tech issues that we were experiencing, right? It's also because the particular water that people brought, they may not get that again next year, and they may not have gotten it last year. The particular state of the heart that you brought to this place may not be the same next year. In fact, it probably will be good that it isn't the same next year, just because it's good that we evolve and change and become new people. And then there's also the sense that many years ago, this was a different community that was gathering for water communion. And many years from now, it'll be different people who come together. What that allows me to do is that in this moment, when we have somehow miraculously drifted together into this place at this time, I can experience and savor the exquisite tenderness and beauty of that. And that, I think, is a message that we can hold in our hearts as we go forth from this place, a lens in which we can look at the relationships in our lives and in our world that need our attention and love and care. Now, we began with a poem about a dandelion seed, and I can't think of really anything in nature. Nature's full of this like impermanence and this drift, but there's just something about dandelion seeds. There's just something about dandelion seeds that when they depart from their stem, you have no idea where they will land. Perhaps there is something else in nature that's about like that I learned about today, which was from Jonathan, right? Coconut seeds, apparently, will spread out in the same way, only on water. But the dandelion seed, we're all so familiar with that from childhood, from life, watching it in just the most carefree way. At one point, they are all together, and in the next moment, they have exploded into the air, and they will drift in all different directions. And so we began today with a poem about it, and I'd like to end with a poem about it for my sermon today. This is from Linda Lee Lyberg. I've been thinking that I'd like to be a dandelion that has no home, roaming free on the sultry breeze until I find some fertile loam. And when I land in a soft emerald pasture, I'll take root and stay, spending my days as an innocent child, joyous and amazed. I'll raise my bright lemon face to meet the healing light, and I'll let bees gather golden pollen as they swarm and dive. I'll watch the peacock butterflies flit from bloom to bloom, tasting the brilliant, bejeweled flowers gone all too soon. But me, I'll be standing there in that hot sun, changing and rearranging into a luminous white-capped one. One day a summer gust will come and my seeds will ascend and I'll float in the air, laissez-faire on the mysterious wind, until I find a place to play and spread my thirsty roots again. My spiritual companions, may we find the exquisite beauty and tenderness of that drift in our lives and savor each moment that brings about its meaning and its poignancy together and in all moments. Amen.